Hello, Mark.
How are you?
Good. Happy Hanukkah.
I don't see you.
You
I hear
don't?
you, but I don't see you.
Oh, let me see. Oh, yeah. Have to lift the flap.
There you go.
There we go.
How are you doing?
Well, I'm doing fine. My question is tomorrow night, what's going to happen?
Yeah, I'm not expecting a crowd.
Expecting anyone?
That's a possibility too. And in the morning, the following morning. And then by next week, it'll be 70s again.
I know. Uh,
I don't mind it for a couple days. I got, it was the 6 months of it in New York that I hated. A couple days doesn't bother me.
right. Except for having to go out and bring in the plants and cover the plants and cover the pipes and
Yeah, and I've already, a couple of years ago, I lost a tree and a lot of bushes, and I'm hoping that's not the case again.
well, it all depends on how long the freeze holds.
Yep.
And I'm hoping, since we're not on the, oh, that's Lily's favorite. That, since we're not on the north side, I think we have a better chance of that not happening.
Yeah, and it's also a day to appreciate not being in Chicago.
For sure.
I heard 15 seconds of exposure equals frostbite.
Yeah.
Yeah, how about Buffalo
Yeah, okay.
or maybe Philadelphia?
Not good.
Yeah.
As I said, the reason I like being here is lots of reasons, but it's a couple days doesn't bother me. 6 months of it bothers me. Suzanne, you're on mute.
I'm not on mute anymore. You know you can't mute me.
And we don't want to.
Suzanne, what did
Whoever said that, thank you very much. No, I missed on Sunday, so that's why I'm here.
Oh,
And
good.
I don't want to go out, but I have a doctor's appointment at 3, just about the time it's supposed to start.
So what did you think of the funeral the other day?
It was interesting.
Which funeral?
Shelley, who had passed away, it was held in a black church. And I participated as, because she was a member here, but her whole family is Christian. And it was truly like a Bible thumping. I'm sitting on the pulpit with ministers, and they're all going, bless the Lord, praise the Lord.
I have been to at least one other middle-class Black funeral, a former boss of mine. It was quite restrained. But I thought the minister, when he said, keep your time down, and I was looking at Lisa and Shelley Nader, we said, wow, we got to keep that. But then when he went on, wow, it was something.
Michael Moore took a picture of me while I was speaking at this funeral that I have to share. Can you see that?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, whose funeral was this?
Shelley Beckford. Shelley was the heavyset Black girl who came on Friday nights. Young woman, 42. She had a heart attack while driving.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
Part of the choir when we had the choir during the
Right.
okay. So I remember her from the choir.
Yeah.
Very interesting woman. I mean, she'd done everything.
Yeah, we heard a lot. 35 people spoke. It was forever. 2 hours and 2.5 hours just in the chapel. That's not including the burial.
Did you go to the burial?
I did not. I had a 12:15 appointment with that. I had to keep sending messages saying I'll be late. All right. What do we have? 12 o'clock. I'm gonna wait another 2 or 3 minutes. We'll get started.
I was at a Black funeral once, and it was fine. It was a fellow worker who they got hit by a car on their anniversary date, and his wife got killed. Very sad. And then the preacher was up there, and everything was going fine. And we went as a group from work, and I couldn't leave when the preacher started to prophesize. That was too much for me, telling me how I was going to go to hell and everything. So that's not appropriate at a funeral. That was my turn, that was my feeling.
Well,
Well, my answer to the "you'll go to hell" is this: at least I'll see my friends.
right, exactly. Why would I want to be somewhere I don't know anyone?
Exactly. George Bernard Shaw wrote something about how, all the best people were going to be in hell. And I read it when I was in high school. And I remember going, yeah. But afterwards, we were talking to her half brother, the guy who got up and spoke.
Right.
And he is a Muslim.
He's a
So
Muslim,
he said,
right.
and he introduced us to his wife and kids. And he said, we had a Jew and a Muslim in the same family. And I guess Grant has had some conversation with him, and he wants to come, I think, some Friday night
Good.
while you are, told him you're going to be gone for a couple months.
And I'm not going, I'm still here till March. I'm not going anywhere.
Yeah,
till
I know
March.
that. Yeah.
Okay. All right, my friends. Glad to see everybody. And so we are here today, and then we have a couple weeks off. We'll come back. I think it's the 11th. Today, we're going to deal with Judaism, the rabbinic period, and the factors that were going on around the society as they were building it. And then when we come back, we have a number of weeks looking at different ways, the whole issue within rabbinic understanding of confronting God and how Jews do that, probably in a way I think Christians would have a heart attack if they heard.
Okay, are we still in the, is it still like the 200 to 500?
Yeah. I'll go a little bit beyond that as well, but that's really that's the context for it, because it's rabbinic in process, biblical and rabbinic in process, yes. And a lot of midrash. Okay. All right. So in Roman times, essentially it was a time of great suffering. The Jews were really under the heel of the Roman rule. It was a time of pessimism, a time of a sense of no hope on the horizon. There were feelings of helplessness among the people that this was not changing. And at the same time, Jews were probably the most oppositional group in the entire empire. They continually refused to surrender to Roman aggression or to hostile public opinion. Go figure, and we've done that for centuries and centuries since. They took this pessimistic outlook of the immediate future, and what they did with it was to add an optimistic view of the ultimate good, of messianic times. Again, when things are terrible and you see no way out, my own term for it is magical thinking. You begin to expect that something will happen from without, from that God will step in. And they had God's pledges that they would survive for all time. And so all of this was playing, and so you had a period in which they really were expecting a messianic figure. And there were dozens of them. What messianism was, however, there were different ways of understanding it. First of all, you had the zealots who were running around saying, war, 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 we need to fight off Rome with war. And for them, the idea of a Messiah was to somebody would come, take up sword in hand, and lead the people in a battle of military power against Rome. You had others who were more apocalyptic in their vision, in the sense that this cataclysm was coming, that a new world would emerge, the chosen people would be the leaders of that new world, and there'd be a transformation of mankind in general. It wasn't simply a war against Rome, it was a throwing off of all of the yoke of suffering in the world. Whatever the actual belief, the particular interpretations, however, most Jewish groups in this period of the Second Commonwealth were of the belief that there was an immediate coming of a Redeemer. Suffering is happening. What you saw in this process, in this time, was a lot of impatience. And so people started to predict, when is the Messiah coming? He'll be here on Thursday at 2:00, whatever the case is, but the predictions were happening. And it's only with a recurrent disappointment, because they would make these predictions, the Messiah wouldn't show up. And it ultimately resulted in the rabbis objecting to the entire process of calculating this end of days. The rabbis took the stance, don't do this. Now, I'm going to tell you, people continue to do it anyway. Let me just give people a chance to come in, a few more. It continued anyway, but the rabbi, and by the way, and by many rabbis as well, but the general perception was this is not something we should be doing. So what we have is a period of great suffering, messianic expectations, and you can see where it's leading. All right, so during this time, there arose a new Jewish sect, soon develops into a great schism, and ultimately into an independent religion, and that's Christianity. And you can understand why it would arise in this world, in the same way that we understand why Shabbatai Tzvi arose in a world following the Khmelnytsky devastations in the 1600s. So for our purposes, the rise of Christianity, we're going to treat it merely from the point of view of its role with the evolution of Judaism in social and religious life and its influence on the Jewish people. I'm not here to teach about Christianity. I'm here to teach about the context of rabbinic life and the impact of Christianity upon that. It's hard to deny that endeavors to sort of reconstruct the details, the reality of the history of the life of Jesus is almost doomed to failure. There's so many sources that provide us with contradictory information that reconstructing the actual life is almost impossible. We really don't know where Jesus is born. Most critical scholars today disregard this Bethlehem myth. All right. They also agree as a general rule that Jesus was probably born a few years before the beginning of the Christian era. So the time and the place of his birth is up for grabs. Some posit that the entire biography of Jesus was written long before his birth. So that in a sense, that you have borrowings from all around. I would suggest to you the following, and Jews have done this as well. We're looking for a Messiah. We go back into the Bible and we determine what the messianic expectations are. The person dies and you subsequently reshape the experiences to fit the pre-existing expectations. And so therefore, when a Christian goes back into the Old Testament to prove Jesus, of course it proves. Of course they can use it as a proof text because that's what the in the same way we can do with Moses. We really don't know, and we can recreate by going back and starting from that as the hindsight is perfect. At any rate, Jesus appears essentially to have been a Pharisaic Jew. From the beginning, he preached in synagogues all over the Galilee, and he was speaking to the disaffected masses, which is the great number of Jewish people under the heel of Roman rule. He attacks the hypocrisy of religious leaders. He attacks the hypocrisy of the wealthy. And there are numerous Jewish as well as Christian scholars who will repeatedly emphasize to you that if you look at his sayings individually, the vast majority come down from an age that preceded the Christian era. They come from rabbinic literature. So if Judaism says, do not do unto others as you don't want them to do unto you, Jesus turns around and says, do to others as you want them to do to you. Okay, you phrase it in the positive. But he's borrowing from Jewish tradition because he is a Pharisaic Jew. The vitriol, the fulminations against the scribes and the Pharisees that you find in the Gospels, even if it's genuine, really are probably superimposed at a later point. It's a retrospective writing, as is much of biblical text, again, as a historian, okay? And it's even more clear that what happened over time is that that hatred towards Jews got sharpened and sharpened and sharpened over centuries. Now, Jesus is aware of the messianic predictions of the Bible. I do want to take 1 second and go back and explain why this is a Messiah concept. I don't know if we did this in here. Did we talk about Samuel? I'm looking for some head shakes. Okay. In Samuel, when he ultimately appoints David as king, God declares, I like David. David's a good boy. And he says there'll always be a descendant of David sitting on the throne of Israel. And what happens when the temple is destroyed and there is no king sitting on the throne of Israel? But God promised there'd be somebody on the throne of Israel. From this arose this concept of there will be a king who once again sits on the throne. How is a king ordained or put into position? They anoint him with oil. So there would be a time in which a new king would arise, a new Mashiach. Messiah means someone anointed with oil. So that's the premise for all of this. And then from there, anytime suffering arose, people would turn and say to God, no. All right, where's our king? We want Messiah. We want Messiah now if you read the streets in New York. Okay? We also can't underestimate the impact of Jesus' personality. You've got people who rise to this position are basically charismatic to begin with. Now, otherwise, they're disappearing quickly. And he's speaking to a distraught people who believe a Messiah is about to arrive anyway. So it's a perfect setting for one, and there were many. This was the long-awaited end of days as far as the Jews were concerned. They had reached the critical mass of suffering, and it's time. What is fascinating and what we need to start to look at, again, we're looking at rabbinic times. In the Messianic age, Jesus, or at least some of his disciples, probably more Paul than Jesus himself, concluded that Jewish law would no longer be adhered to. There would be no need for it. And they took the Talmudic statement that even the Shabbat can be disregarded for the sake of man, meaning if somebody's dying. All right. I was in shul in my 30s or 20s, and I was in New York, and an elderly woman who had no family fell on Simchat Torah dancing and had to be taken to the hospital. I got in the car, in the ambulance with her. She needed someone to escort her. For the sake of those kinds of things, the yontif and some of the restrictions are put aside. That was the intent of that statement. And what happens is Jesus puts it aside for some things, and Paul declares the whole legal system, throw out the baby with the bathwater. The whole legal system has no place. This teaching meets the needs of many of the pacifists. Again, the world is one in which there's Roman suffering. You've got zealots reaching and screaming war, 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 war. And so someone who preaches some sense of peace, he wasn't the only one, is going to have an audience amongst those not ready for war, by definition. Okay. Despite the seemingly peaceful nature of his work or his words, nonetheless, within Rome, it was received as hostile and nonconformist. If you are a country, at the end of the day, what does Putin want? Putin wants the Russians to not say anything, to just live quietly and be at peace. I don't want any kind of revolutions. I don't want uprisings. I don't want protests. I want calm and peace, and nobody should ever question anything. Go live your lives peacefully, and we'll do what we're doing. That's what the Romans wanted. And here comes somebody who's preaching that what they're doing is wrong. And so clearly he was not well received by the Romans. And modern scholars will tell you, despite Christian writings, it was the Romans who basically said we'd had enough of Jesus and this has to stop. It wasn't necessarily the Jews. But at the same time, let me not suggest to you that the Pharisees were fans. They were not. The Pharisees had no sense of friendliness to Jesus. The bulk of Jews opposed Jesus, and the only question was, what do you do with it? And the Pharisees, also pacifists, may have rejected it, but this wasn't, their style was not one of harshness. They wouldn't have responded in the sense of a crucifixion. That's not the way. It was the Roman way. Rabban Gamliel's speech against the condemnation of Peter gives you some insight to what the Pharisees would have done. He says, refrain from these men, let them alone. For if this counsel is the work of these men, it's going to come to naught anyway. They're not going to succeed. Leave them alone. That really was the Pharisaic approach. Thoughts, comments before I go on? And a welcome to everybody who came in late. Glad you're here. So crucifixion was a manner of punishment reserved for the worst criminals in society. Not everybody who was put to death was crucified. This was considered the worst of the worst. And needless to say, Jesus' death stresses his disciples. This is not good news. And as a result of his death in the immediate time, the opponents of Jesus began to jeer at what they called the hanged one, and applied to him a phrase from Deuteronomy, which says, "For he that is hanged is accursed by God." It isn't until somebody comes up with this vision of a resurrection that they regain their composure and some sense of trying to make sense of what's happened to this. They begin to emphasize the Last Supper, the crucifixion, the resurrection, and here is an answer to this agonizing death of the founder of the religion. Again, I don't know if I told the story of the spaceship. I think I did in here. Of the followers of the spaceship and the psychologists. I'm not seeing any head shakes. I'm going to tell it again. All right. In the 1950s, Sandy, you may remember, okay? In the 1950s, there was a psychologist saw a report in the New York Times that a group of people believed that the world was going to be destroyed, and that at midnight on a specified day, a spaceship would land in a particular parking lot and take away the true believers and before the world is destroyed. Psychologist takes one look at this and says, I got to see this, and I'm going. Midnight arrives, and I can tell you what doesn't arrive. There's no spaceship. So now I parallel this to I have a Messiah and he dies. Now what? Did the people stand there in the spaceship and say, we were idiots. We're standing in a parking lot waiting for a spaceship. What's wrong with me? That's not what they did. They basically, they reinterpreted the data. That's what you do in those kinds of situations to the following. Because we were true followers, there was no need for a spaceship and the world will be saved. Yes.
But it's part of that myth. Was JFK Jr. going to be on the spaceship?
That sounds like a great drosh. All right. But you can see what happens when you believe in someone and he dies. You're forced to confront that with making sense of it. And so what happens over time is you begin these whole resurrection, because resurrection was part of Jewish thought by that point from Persian belief. And so it was instituted as a way to make sense of this. He died for us. I hope you hear the power of that. I mean, I know when I was sitting in class and heard that story, I'm sitting in a room full of non-Jews and saying to myself, does anybody else hear this? Am I the only one?
Well, can I ask a question? I mean, were there other similar kinds of sects around that time, not just the one that followed Jesus that believed in the resurrection? As I recall in Jewish history, there was this idea of the resurrection, you know.
Well,
I
yeah,
mean, it wasn't what we call Jesus now, but yeah.
So let me just very quickly review what I was saying. Because of Roman persecution, the people felt they had no hope, and therefore they turned to messianic thinking, and there was an expectation of a Messiah to show up. Lots of them did. Jesus was one of them. All right, who survives oftentimes is who writes about it historically. You need a biographer. Paul was a wonderful marketer, and documents started to get written, and that's how religions occur. Again, I'm saying this as a historian. Please, God, don't smack me down. All right. with the later victory of Pauline interpretation of Christianity, because at the end of the day, it's Paul's views that do survive, and the growing excess of the Christian mission to the Gentiles, they almost needed an ever sharper line of demarcation between the old ways of Judaism and this new religion. There was a need to say, this is how we differ. This is why you should join us. Almost everybody was believing the end of days is coming, one way or another. There was a small group that formed around James and Peter, largely Galilean, who exulted in this and that there is the Messiah is coming. In the meantime, nonetheless, during this whole time, while they're talking about messianic and belief in Jesus, etc., they're still living as Palestinian Jews. In terms of my comments about a biographer, among their contemporaries, Peter and James actually were accorded greater importance than Paul. But for us, the relative greatness of these other apostles is skewed by the fact that they left no literary remains. There was no biographer to tell their story. There were gospels to tell Paul's version. Now, there were major distinctions in the beliefs between James and Paul. Let me give you a quote from James, all right? No Orthodox Jew could have gone further than James when he said, "For whoever shall keep the whole law and yet offend even one point in it is guilty of all of it." That's what you would imagine you'd hear out of the Hasidic Rebbe. James was pretty firm on the law. And the Pharisees recognized the allegiance of these specific apostles, and they refused to join in the violent persecutions of them. When James is executed by the Sadducees, that is condemned, according to Josephus, by all moderate and law-abiding citizens. So again, you've got this schism that Paul probably is not happy when the Pharisees attack those who attack James, his opponent. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so Paul has all the more reason to dislike the Pharisees. All right. Any other thoughts or comments? Seeing none? Okay, let's talk about Paul. First of all, Paul was Saul. Brilliant name change. A marketer extraordinaire who couldn't come up with a better name change than from Paul to Saul, from Saul to Paul. He assumes the leadership. He is clearly a visionary. Nobody achieves what he achieves without being a visionary in some way, but he also has a fine sense of reality, and he begins to adapt Jesus's teachings, which are more esoteric. He begins to adapt them to actual life. He was essentially a man of fairly independent means, a skilled craftsman. He enjoyed the benefits of being a Roman citizen. And one of his major focuses, and this is an important distinction, was in terms of focus on world Jewry rather than Palestinian Jewry. This is important because in Palestine, there was a rebellious anti-Roman mood. And the rest of the world, not under Roman rule, that didn't exist. And so he's preaching to people who are not, he decides that this rebellious group I'm not going to win with. I'll go elsewhere. He also, and this is critical, does not object to the prevailing economic system. In short, accepting the social order as it is, he visualizes the victory of Christianity merely as a prolongation and a crowning of the expansion of Judaism. Jesus's teachings focused on the kingdom of heaven. They weren't so much focused on the world as it existed. It was what will happen in the afterlife in this ultimate world. And so therefore, it affirmed the existing realities. This is why you have in many throughout much of Christian history, an acceptance of poverty, an acceptance of status of groups in different groups. It doesn't have to change. We don't need to work towards the extension because the real reward comes in the world to come. Doesn't matter. This is all trivial. God ordained in this world who will be wealthy, who will be in royalty, who will be, etc. It's all a caste system. That's not your concern. Let's just make sure everybody gets into heaven. Within this approach, very soon Paul discovers what he considers the chief obstacle to expanding Judaism. Outside of Israel in particular, there was a feeling that the yoke of law weighed heavily. You can imagine a population that is poor, slaves, hired workers, people in real dire straits who have to work constantly, turning around and disregarding dietary laws and Shabbat and other regulations. It's not primary in their world. You know, I think back and I can't imagine he was unique. My great-grandfather came from Russia and for 10 years worked to raise the money to bring his family to America. This Orthodox man worked on Shabbat. I cannot imagine that's a unique story. Right? So when your basic needs need to be attended to, sometimes religious law gets put aside, but it also creates in the process a sense of guilt. I am a sinner. You also had a group of people who wanted to join Judaism, but didn't want to accept all the laws. And so what does Paul do? He finds a formula and he says, you all are Jews. You believe in the spiritual tenets of Judaism. And for a time, all this ritual law was necessary, but now we have the Messiah. None of it is necessary anymore. It's a much easier religion to buy into. Plain and simply, when you take obligation off the table, religion becomes much easier. Does anybody have reading number one? All right, Sandy, would you read number one? Go ahead.
Be it known unto you, therefore, men and brethren, that through this man is preached unto you the forgiveness of sins, and by him all that believe are justified from all things from which you could not be justified by the law of Moses.
That's from Acts, right out of the Christian Bible. There's no lack of clarity here. Okay, the time has come for the law to go away. We don't need the law. Israel in the flood. Yes, Lou.
I know this is not a course on Christianity, but was Paul the first to espouse that belief in Jesus was everything?
Yeah, I as far as I understand from the writings, that would be my gut instinct. Now, Jesus canceled certain laws in his presence. In other words, because he believed he's bringing this miracle to the table. And so in this moment, you don't need laws, but it's Paul who then takes, as I said, the whole kit and caboodle and says, none of this matters. Even if Jesus isn't present, the law doesn't matter. I believe that in a large way, Paul is the founder of Christianity. Okay. He also then goes on and says that Israel in the spirit has been replaced by a more universal body of men. Israel in the flesh has been replaced by Israel in the spirit. This is terminology that comes from Jeremiah. That was not, Jeremiah doesn't talk about replacement. He talks about the circumcision of the heart, okay? But he's not replacing circumcision in the body. He's saying that we need both. Paul comes along and says, never mind this both stuff. We don't need the circumcision anymore. We only need circumcision of the heart. It's a complete misstatement of Jeremiah's intent. So there were as I mentioned to you, lots of preachers running around at this point, particularly at one point, Paul is in Athens, and I've no doubt in Athens, he had little difficulty finding debaters, because there's people, this argumentative crowd that's been rhetorically trained, all standing on street corners spouting a theology of some sort. This was the norm. And he would get into discussions with them. But the moment he asserted that the Redeemer had risen from the dead, the logic of Greek thought, these people laughed him out of the streets. All right, he left Athens with no success at all at organizing a Christian community. Instead, where he found the active listeners was among the unknowledgeable masses of the people who had a deep yearning for salvation, and it gets heightened. Here, sometimes you don't hear some of the other factors at play. In 48 to 51, throughout the entire Mediterranean world, on top of all of the other problems, there was a severe famine. People are suffering. They need words of comfort. They need a hope that a magical answer will show up. Paul walks into this and says, I have your magical answer. All right. Initially, Paul and his version of Christianity was deeply resented by many of the Christians in Palestine. They were deep Jews, all right, and they weren't necessarily ready to, even if they embraced a messianic figure, they weren't ready to give up Jewish law in process. And many of those people regarded Paul as an apostate, as someone who had converted out. However, what happens over time is there is a shift in the center of gravity from Palestine to the diaspora. And in that way, Jewish life begins to dissipate a little bit. And if it wasn't true before, the fall of Jerusalem decides the issue for many people. The destruction of the temple transfers Christian leadership to the Hellenistic countries, specifically Syria. And what you have now is a disappearance of what was a unifying center in Jerusalem. And all that does without that center, it widens the breach between Judaism and Christianity. Christians begin to understand the destruction of the temple as God's anger against a formerly chosen people, and they are now the new chosen people. They are the real Jews. They are the real Israelites. Now, how did Jews understand the destruction? Very differently. Jews have looked at any time something historically, any tragedies that have happened, and said, well, we missed. God punished us for our failures. We have to double down on what we're doing. We have to recommit to mitzvot, and God will redeem. So you've got one group saying that, the Jews, and you've got Christians saying this is a sign of your utter rejection. Couple other points here. Interesting, Paul's journeys never took him to Babylonia and never took him to Egypt, where there were large Jewish communities. He didn't cross the frontiers to Parthia. All these places had multiple possible Jews for awaiting conversion. And he never went to any of those for a couple of reasons. One, journeys of that length were very difficult. Again, people were not making those kinds of journeys on a regular basis. Two, there were tenuous cultural relationships between the Greek-speaking Western Jews and their Babylonian co-religionists. We know that the Jews in Palestine and the Jews in Babylonia weren't necessarily the best of friends in many ways. And the other piece is, in Babylonia, they didn't speak Greek. Little issues. He's preaching in Greek. They don't understand. Ultimately, though, again, these were nations in which they were not feeling the oppression of Rome, and therefore they were much stronger in their Jewish sentiment. They were not feeling threatened in any way. It also made them harder to convert. They weren't looking for a Messiah figure. So as a result, Paul is driven to the Hellenistic Jews and the Gentiles and to Hellenistic and Roman views on life. There were a number of Greek mystery religions of the time. And that began to furnish Christianity with a series of ceremonies and rites that replaced Jewish observances. You know about Christianity, a lot of times what they would do is they were much more open than Judaism was. If you had a new community down the street that had their own God, they would shift that God into a saint so that the people could join Christianity and bring their adored one with them. Judaism didn't do that. So these different customs came from different places for Christianity and replaced Jewish ways. It's a curious irony of history that the leaders of a group of people who denounce Jewish legalism, who denounce Jewish ritualism, who denounce Jewish ceremonialism, immediately are compelled to adopt a whole new set of ceremonies, rituals, and behaviors. There is probably no religion in the world more ceremonial and ritual than Christianity. And again, I offer up the election of a pope. Right? The inauguration of kings is very similar. It's based on Christian ways. All right. So it's impossible to exist outside of rituals. That's the reality. Humans have a need. So while they're screaming and yelling that Jews have all these rituals, they created their own. It's a human need. Over the next few centuries, there's a theological battle between Jews and Christians in their attempt to attract converts. And again, I want to dissuade us of this concept that Judaism has never been a religion that seeks converts. That is not true. That has become the case from the Middle Ages on, because Christians not only would kill the convert, they'd kill the person who did the conversion. And so that could be a discouraging behavior. All right. But historically, Jews were out to get converts in the same way Christians were. And I've seen a number of articles in a number of Reform magazines in recent years that have suggested it's time that we do the same thing. Each, in their attempt to gain converts, each community, the Jews and the Christians, demonized the other because they, whoever they were, rejected the truth. That demonization finds its way into text, both in Christian texts and into rabbinic thought. It's not a lot different than politics today. In rabbinic text, there are references made of Jesus and his followers through the symbol of Balaam. Balaam was the foreign prophet of biblical times against whom the rabbis railed. They did not want to embrace Balaam in any way. And so what they did is they spoke about Christians as the Balaams, Jesus as Balaam and all of his followers. They put him down through association. From the Christian side, according to the 5th century Christian Isaac of Antioch, the guilt that was associated with the golden calf should have, but did not humble their Jews or their emphasis on law. And Isaac stated that those who didn't need the law, they didn't receive it to begin with. It was only sinners who needed a law. Reading number 2, I think, Rona, you said you had the readings. Would you do this one?
I had the wrong ones, but now I have it. So, okay. Our master revoked the curse of the law for the nations with his cross. Circumcision is now not done with hands, but in the spirit, by a removal that removes from evil, namely baptism. Isaac of Antioch.
Right. All right. So, essentially it's a mikvah. They have baptism, we have a mikvah. The purposes may be slightly different, but the behavior is the same. So no longer do we need any of this.
Oh, and there's another one below that.
Yeah.
You want to read
The
that
6th
one?
century, this is a century later, Jacob, go for it.
God had rejected the Jews and exiled them because they killed Jesus. They had killed Jesus. The Jews were no longer God's chosen people in the way the Christians are. And that's 6th century. Jacob of
We know that for sure by the 6th century, the accusation that the Jews were responsible for the killing of Jesus was already in existence. We know by the 6th century that this concept of supersessionism, that Christianity had replaced Judaism as the true way towards God, existed. That gives us at least a time frame on it. But I'm going to switch hats in a second, but before I do, any thoughts on the Christian Jewish time and how it affected the rabbis and thought? All right, so I'm going to switch hats now. I'm going to talk about Zoroastrianism. All right, the Jews were generally prohibited from providing tools for pagan worship, even if Jews didn't get involved in that worship. So if it was something that was used for pagan form, you weren't allowed to in any way help them find those tools. The reason I say that is the rabbinic courts enforced laws not to make use of wine, which might have been offered as libations to idols. And I think that's the source of the distinction with kosher wine. All right. It really is perceived as, and so for ritual purposes, I know I make the distinction. I drink any wine generally because I don't like the concept that, gee, a non-Jew touched it, I can't drink it. For ritual purposes, I do make the distinction. Okay, if it's going to be something to which I'm dedicating the moment to God, I do, but in general, but that I think is the underlying source of where that comes from. The rabbinical courts enforced laws not to make use of wine, as I said to you, for idols. There was obviously a need to demand that Jews not participate in pagan festivals, not to invite Jews to partake in Jewish holidays. When there's a demand, what is it telling you is going on in the general society? That's what they're doing. Community is doing just that. There's all sorts of interactions and interrelationships between. There was a fear of foreign influence from living among these pagans and luring luring Jews away from the true God. And there was a sense of, let's not get drunk in the midst of foreigners. It's going to lead to intermarriage and all sorts of other things. Shared drinks, shared social opportunities would have a disastrous outcome and demanded a discouragement of hospitality to pagans. By the way, Christians did the same thing. For centuries, Jews would not eat with Christians, but Christians would not eat with Jews. But at the same time, I want to go back to the fact that they're instituting all of these rules. What is it telling you the practical reality on the street is? It's happening anyway. There's no need for law in the absence of somebody not engaging in something. So the reason I want to go to Zoroastrianism because I believe that there is major influence on Judaism. The Jews lived, I've mentioned this to you before, in Babylonia and Persia, where the Zoroastrianism was dominant. And it influenced their thinking. And this was in the third, the fourth, and the fifth centuries before the Common Era. Christianity emerges from Judaism in the first century, and they are already adapting that which came with Zoroastrianism. So they're also deeply affected by this. Let's talk about who they are and what the influence. So at the age of 30, this Zoroastria felt himself called into Ahura Mazda's, the Persian god, his presence for for purification and for ascendancy into prophecy. This is the tale, okay? The prophet avowed the purpose of preaching a universal, progressive religion, converting the wicked, and giving himself as a self-sacrifice to God. I want you to hear, throughout this, I want you to hear the overtones of Judaism and I want you to hear the overtones of Christianity, both. Self-sacrifice to God should be ringing a bell. Reading number 3, anybody else have this? All right, so Sandy, you're up again. Reading number 3.
Zarathustra, or Zoroaster, taught, among other things, the worship of one deity, Ahura Mazda. Through Ahura Mazda was, though
he was supreme.
Ahura Mazda was supreme, he was opposed by an evil one. Each man's soul was also the battleground between good and evil. The good man chooses right. In the end, good would overcome evil.
All right. So for the first time in world religion, eschatology, the conception of this last days, the world to come, really emerges as prominent. According to these teachings, there is a general resurrection that will take place at the end of the present world order. In some, Zoroastrianism can be succinctly defined as the religion of ethical dualism. Ethical dualism. The three words also sum up this religion. They would often say, be like God. The Bible says constantly, Ki kadosh ani. Why should you do it? Because I, the Lord your God, am holy. Be like me. Now, one of the things to question throughout this whole process is, what did we borrow from them and what did they borrow from us? It's not always clear the direction of the borrowings. So Ahura Mazda is described, you should hear the echoes, omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient. He is the Lord of creation. He is the supreme being. And ultimately, he will triumph over evil. The prophet Zoroaster declares that God revealed to him the deity's first name. That name, and I want you to hear the echo, is I am. All right, Bible describes God as saying, my name is Eheyeh Asherah Eheyeh, I am that I am. Where do the borrowings go? Which direction? Right, we don't know. What makes Zoroastrianism particularly different, though, is that good is matched by evil in the universe. And so reading number 4, Rona, would you do, who didn't read the second time? All right, Suzanne, would you read reading number 4?
The sage of Iran furnished a solution of this mystery by positing to primeval powers at war with each other of these principles. It is called Spenda Manu, beneficent spirit, and the other Angramania, the evil spirit. The two spirits exist in a relation to each other. They meet in the higher unity of Ahura Mazda.
Now, and by the way, Spenta Maya is the message about him is that he's the son of Ahura Mazda. Okay, so what you've got is two warring, in a sense, descendants of God. And it sounds an awful lot like Jesus and Satan and God. Okay, Judaism didn't buy that, but it left them with another problem. It's always left Jews with the problem. The problem is, what do you do with evil? Okay, and in Isaiah we're told, Yotzer or uvorei choshech oseh shalom uvorei et hara, that God is still the source. God is the source of everything, good, bad, evil, everything. There is no second power in the universe. Well, that presents its own problems, and there's all sorts of theological issues. But so God is the Lord of all the world, creating evil, creating good. But we're also told uvacharta chayim, that God wants and desires the good. That's how they come out of it. It's not a perfect answer any more than Christian answers are either. There's a lot of disagreement among scholars as to the source of the commonalities between Jewish thought and Christian thought and that of Zoroastrianism. It's not 100% agreed upon. Some suggest, and I find this a little hard to believe, that the doctrines developed separately and spontaneously. I'm not buying it, but I want to put it out there. The majority, however, argue that there's incredible Persian influence, particularly concerning this concept of Satan. You understand that in Jewish thought, there is no possibility that even if there's a Satan, that in any way he poses a threat to God's rule. Satan, at best, is an angel that has to obey God. It is not the Satan of Christian thought. There is this, within Zoroastrianism, a full-blown and well-developed theology of immortality, of bodily resurrection, and the end of days. The spiritual aspects of man preceded his physical aspects. In other words, the soul exists prior to the body and therefore would exist post-life as well. That certainly entered Judaism, and it certainly dominates Christian thought. The doctrine of reward and punishment extended into the next life was essentially a form of that. It was a derivation of that kind of thinking. Man enters heaven or hell after death according to the way he lives on earth. Well, that certainly sounds, we've heard those kinds of things before. To sum up, for the Zoroaster held that the individual soul was immortal, that it was judged after death and assigned to either heaven or hell, and at the final judgment day, there would be a separation of the righteous and the wicked, and none of this would take place or could take place until the appearance of the last Messiah. Listen to this in Zoroastrian thought, until the appearance of the last Messiah, who would be born of a virgin mother. This is 500 years before Jesus. Now I open the floor. Yes, Suzanne.
Bringing in the Zoroastrianism that I can never pronounce, sorry, this is all new to me. Again, as I have said in many occasions, this is not something that most people learn in their general Jewish education. And it makes sense, but it also, of course, we can see that there are many that would say, no, what we did was, or have done, is original. And is that the reason why it is not taught?
Well, if you believe, if you're a fundamentalist, you believe that the ways of Judaism are direct hand down from God.
Mm-hmm.
That there, I think that, and again, I always worry about overgeneralizing, but the further right you move, the less likely you are to believe that there were cultural influences that were the source of these kinds of behaviors. Okay, and so yes, it is all from God. It is not culturally affected. That's ridiculous. As you move into the critical biblical analysis and world of criticism historically as well, you do start to take into account where were they living, what were the ways of the people, and how did it play. My sermon, I think it's tomorrow night, is going to talk about Hanukkah and the fact that American Hanukkah has adapted Christmas.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Right, we recognize that. Why would we think that in historical times it was different?
Yeah,
So there's still a Zoroastrian religion. In fact, they're in the Southwest. I think it might be on West Belfort.
I believe it's the only Zoroastrian place in the country.
Really, I've passed it. I always have been curious about that.
I'm fascinated because of the parallels. Yes.
Yeah. So the Jews lived, can I ask a question? So the Jews lived in what we call Persia now, right? For many centuries, and had a lot of influence. And weren't the Persians mostly known for, if not the creation, at least the ongoing belief in Zoroastrianism?
Yes. Yeah, no, for sure.
That was a primary religion for many centuries.
Yeah, primarily, but certainly when the Jews lived there was in the centuries prior to the 3rd, 4th, and 5th century prior to the Common Era. It's under
Right.
Cyrus. Okay,
Right, but
That
so,
period of time.
so we must have absorbed, like every other culture we've ever lived in, you know, this idea, I mean, some of the principal ideas, maybe not all of them completely, or we would have been wiped out and called Zoroastrian as Zoroastrian, yeah? But I guess I'm wondering, like, which about this eternal life and this idea that, you know, that we're, I mean, you can find reincarnation, you can find everything in Judaism over the last 2,000 years. So which of the ones were really the ones that we still kind of think about when we think about Zoroastrianism?
Well, so I pointed out on a number of occasions that if you look in the Bible, death is final. There is no afterlife.
Right.
It isn't until the Jews lived among the Zoroastrian, the Persians,
Right.
that this idea entered. At the same time, as we also encountered, what we found is there's some borrowings from Judaism that made their way into Persia as well. There clearly is a sharing. I mean, look, American society, if you use the word chutzpah, most people know what you're talking about. There's borrowings that go both ways.
Yeah.
Now we're far more insignificant numerically here in America than they probably were in Persia at the time. So the influence is not as great in that direction. But I would say to you, it's impossible to live in a community and not see at least wisdom in some of their ways. You may superimpose new meaning upon it. All right. You know, would it surprise me in 1,000 years the Jews had Christmas trees and there'd be some Jewish understanding of what a Christmas tree is? No, it would not shock me. We borrow and superimpose new meaning.
So the main difference that I'm taking away from the Zoroastrians of ancient times is that they also did not want to believe in an afterlife.
No, they did. The Jews didn't.
Oh, they did.
Right. The
Jews did,
Zoroastrians did.
That's one out, yeah.
Right. Yeah. And after like punishment, the Messiah became a. Yeah, so you see the Jewish influence, and then the minute you say the Messiah is the born of a virgin, well, you kind of hear Christian influence.
Right.
Right. Or the two battling sons, in a sense. You hear Christian influence.
The two battling sons.
Right. You have the good and the evil. Well, that's Jesus and the devil.
Yeah. Well, was it really, I mean, you know, anti-Semitism used to go against so many thousands and thousands of years. Was it really, you know, I mean, we read the story of Haman at the time of the Zoroastrians, you know, in Persia, what we call now. And so do we have records or any kind of historical evidence that they were, you know, mostly assimilated and not? I mean, do we have
I'm sorry, totally what?
assimilated into Zoroastrian culture? I mean, they must have hung on to some Judaism.
So no, they're first of all, the records between the biblical period and the 200s are less. There's no question about there's a lesser. But I would say to you, look at the story of Esther.
Yeah.
Right? Esther did not move into the king's palace and eat kosher food. I don't care what any Orthodox Jew tells you. I'm not buying it. Her very name, Mordecai's name, as derivatives of Ishtar and Marduk, the Babylonian gods. It tells you, you know, it's look, one of the ways they'll be able to describe our assimilation is, what do you mean he had a name Mark? You're telling me he was named after a gospel?
Right.
Now, my parents didn't think in those terms, but they had already been so assimilated into society that was an acceptable name.
Right. John, you know, whatever.
Right. My grandmother used to say, what kind of name is Maka? Because Maka is a curse in Yiddish.
Right.
That was what she understood it. What kind of is that?
The name Natalie, one of the reasons when I was looking for an end name for my daughter, I had a hard time because I didn't want it to signify birth, Natal, which is born, then taken to mean born on Christmas, you know, born. So I was searching all over for a name that didn't, besides Naomi, and I didn't, that was such an old fashioned name, you know, that just to find something that didn't come from that didn't come from Natal, born on Christmas. How many Jewish Natalies? There's many.
Look, one of my favorite stories, I literally had a couple in my first congregation, Jews for generations, Joseph and Mary.
A lot of Jews are named Mary and Joseph, yep.
Right. So that's assimilation. I don't think their parents sat down and said, let's name them after a Christian. I don't think that was part of their thought at all. It was just simply, it's the new way. That's what we do. That's how assimilation happens, by the way. It's usually not a direct attempt to get rid of Judaism, but nonetheless, its outcome is often negative.
Well, often it's just anglicized, from Miriam and Joseph. So it's just anglicized or Germanized or whatever, Latinized, if you want to call it Latin, right?
Not all acculturation is bad, but there's always been this fear of what does that lead us to? Anybody else? All right, so we'll be back.
That's sort of why you have people, the very religious, who are getting more and more just among themselves. There's a fear of what you're talking about.
The Satmar Hasidim, who simply they just lock themselves away, as opposed to the Lubavitch who didn't send out Chabad, right? There are different thoughts on, but again, if you go into the Chabad world, not the Chabad world, the Lubavitch world in New York, they're not reaching out to the people around them. It's only the designates that they send out to the community that do outreach.
Yeah.
They're also somewhat insular.
Yeah, they are, because they kind of looked at my daughter like she was an apostate when she came in to buy things for Passover, and she never went back.
My uncle was a Lubavitch. My uncle joined the Lubavitch sect, and when he passed away, and my father showed up for the funeral, his brother, they treated him like crap.
Yeah, but it's. I think it would be really interesting to learn more about the present Zoroastrians sometime.
Yeah. I actually have the same. I like learning about those kinds of things because it gives you insight into how these things all play. I love, one of the reasons I'm teaching history is I love to look at those developmental cultural features that have made their way in, and which we've always assumed this is the way it started, but the reality of it is it's not. It didn't just, God didn't say, you know what, your name should be Mark.
Mark, just an interesting thing you were mentioning about the Hasidim. You have the Satmar Hasidim from Satmar, Hungary. Satmar was Hungarian for Saint Mary.
Oh, seriously?
Really, I didn't know that.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome.
Didn't know that either.
That was just the name of a county or a city in there. No,
Yeah.
it's the name.
Yeah, it was the city that they're from. A lot of, I think, is Lubavitch were from a village of Lubavitch in Russia, or
Lubavitch,
I think
The Lubavitch are from Liadi,
yeah.
from where?
Liadi in Ukraine.
Okay.
We have cities also, I know this has come up in the signing of ketubas and things to that effect. Rabbis who did weddings down in Corpus Christi,
Right.
which means the body, and if you look in the ketubah, what they do is they'll write in Corpus Christi, because they don't want to put the body of Jesus into the document.
Right. What did you say they put in? Because I had a rabbi friend that was his first pulpit in Corpus Christi. Yeah. What do they put in instead of Corpus
Instead of
Christi?
instead of the K sound, they make it a ch. So it's Corpus Christi.
Or try to convince people to get married elsewhere.
That's not right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah,
All right.
that was his first post, and it was hard.
But I hope the historical piece of the course thus far has been of value. We'll look at a particular angle on, as I said to you, on rabbinic thought in terms of rebelling against God and confronting God over the next weeks when we come back. And that will use, as I said, a lot of midrash. That will be the tool in which we'll explore. Okay? Everyone, a happy Hanukkah.
Happy
Stay
Hanukkah.
warm.
Shalom, happy Hanukkah, and thanks for another great class.
Yes.
Thank you.
Great
Stay
class.
warm.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.